Good morning, students. Well, I'm trying a new technology today. I think we've had two videos so far, and you may recall that I told you the first video I prepared for you was lost, so I had to redo it. While preparing the video for my other course, my social and political philosophy course, the other day, I recorded a 70-minute video, and immediately when I clicked finish, I waited for it to upload to Canvas, and I got a sad face on my screen and could not find the video. So the video just disappeared. I had to decide whether to redo the video or do something else, and it's really not important as far as my logic class, what I did there. But anyway, I'm trying a new technology. Instead of recording in Studio, which is in Canvas, I'm recording with Photo Booth, which is on my Apple computer, and apparently it will record whatever I want for as long as I want, and when I'm done I can simply upload it to Canvas. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that this technology works a little bit better than the other one, since I've already lost two videos. I don't want that to happen again. Well, today we're going to discuss section 1.2 of Hurley. I'll refer to the author of our textbook from now on as Hurley. And this is a little bit of a long section of the book, about 10 pages of text, followed by a summary of the section and some exercises. So let's get started. You may recall the definition of an argument to a philosopher, or more specifically to a logician. An argument is a group of two or more statements or propositions. Remember, I'm using the terms statement and proposition interchangeably. Anyway, an argument to a logician is a group of two or more statements, one of which, the conclusion, is claimed by the arguer to support or provide evidence for the other or others, which are called the premises. So every argument has at least one premise. Some of them have several. In theory, an argument could have a billion or more premises, but of course, practically speaking, that's impossible because nobody could even read so many premises, much less understand them. So we can say that for practical purposes, an argument would have to have a small number of premises, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5. Every argument, by definition, has exactly one conclusion. So if you think there are more than two conclusions in a given passage, then there must be at least two arguments, one for each of those conclusions. Keep in mind that sometimes people put arguments together in the form of a chain. We call these chain arguments. So if I argue in favor of a proposition, if I argue in favor of some proposition, once I have established that proposition, it can then become a premise of a new argument that I go on to make. And the conclusion of that argument might become a premise of a third argument. So the arguments hook together like links of a chain. That's called a chain argument. Notice that it may appear that there is more than one conclusion, but there are really several arguments, one conclusion per argument. So to a logician, arguments are the main thing to be focused upon. Every argument expresses an inference made by a person like you and me. So the trick when you're confronted with a passage, either written or spoken, is to determine, first of all, whether it contains or expresses an argument. Some passages, some paragraphs, for example, express arguments, and some do not. So it's a valuable skill to know how to examine that passage or that paragraph and determine whether in fact it does express an argument. So that's what this section deals with. Notice the title of section 1.2, Recognizing Arguments. And in the course of today's lecture, I'm going to be going through the section and looking at a number of non-arguments. So these are tips that you can use as you examine a passage to determine whether it contains an argument. Okay, so the main thing you look for in an argumentative passage is a claim that one proposition follows from one or more others, because that's the telltale sign of an argument. So the premises of the argument are claimed by the arguer to provide reasons or evidence in favor of the conclusion. Now, the claim that the conclusion follows from the premises can be either explicit or implicit. Explicit means out there, visible, so to speak, public. Implicit means hidden, not visible, not public. So sometimes when we argue, we make it explicit that we're arguing, and we do that in different ways. One way we do it is to simply tell your audience that you're about to make an argument. If I want to be as explicit as I can, I may say the following to someone. I'm about to make an argument. First, let me state my conclusion. Here it is. And then I would state my conclusion. Now I'm about to state the two premises that I claim support that conclusion. The first premise is such and such. The second premise is so and so. Notice that when I make that argument, I'm leaving no doubt in my audience's mind what the premises are and what the conclusion is. And therefore, I'm making I'm giving my audience no doubt that I'm making an argument. Sometimes we don't go that far. We make an argument explicitly, but all we do is use indicator words. I may say, for example, I may state a proposition and then state another proposition and then say, therefore, such and such. The word therefore, which you know is a conclusion indicator, tells my reader explicitly that I'm making a claim that one of my propositions follows from the other two. So that's still an explicit statement of an argument. But sometimes when we argue, we don't use indicator words. We sometimes simply state our conclusion, and then we state one or more premises that we are claiming support that conclusion. And we do so without using words like therefore, thus, so, consequently, or premise indicators such as since, because, as, and so on. So the trick in determining whether a passage contains an argument is, first of all, look for indicator words. And if you find some, that should help you identify the conclusion and the premise or premises that are claimed to support it. Now, keep in mind that when you examine a written or spoken passage to determine whether it expresses an argument, you have to use your judgment. There's no mechanical procedure. In fact, suppose you find the word thus in a particular passage. We know that the word thus is a conclusion indicator, but it's not a conclusion guarantor. There's no guarantee that every occurrence of the word thus indicates an argument or a conclusion. So you have to still use your judgment. Human beings have this capacity called judgment. We use it every day, and we certainly use it when we're examining passages to determine whether they express or contain arguments. So we humans are not mere computers. You could program a computer to look for every occurrence of certain words like thus or therefore. But as I've just explained, sometimes those words appear when in fact there's no argument being expressed. So all you can do is use your judgment, your best judgment. And that's partly what we're doing today. I'm going to teach you some tips to exercise your judgment to determine whether a passage expresses an argument. Okay, turn to page 15. Hurley has some words of caution on that page. First of all, he says, this is about the middle of page 15, the mere occurrence of an indicator word by no means guarantees the presence of an argument. Now, that's a point I made just a moment ago, but let's look at a particular example of that now. Hurley's first example goes like this. Since Edison invented the phonograph, there have been many technological innovations. Now, the word since, as you know, is a premise indicator. And so you may think that that's an argument. But actually, the word since has another function. The word since sometimes indicates the passage of time. It's called the temporal sense of the word since. So what this sentence says is that there was a time at which Edison invented the photograph, a particular time. After that, in terms of time, at some time later, there were many technological innovations. So that is not an argument. The word since there records the passage of time or the order in which something happened, two things happened. So you have to be careful when you see words like that. They're not always functioning as premise or conclusion indicators. In the second example, Hurley says the word since is used in a logical sense, not a temporal sense. In that case, there is an argument. Let's take a look at it. Since Edison invented the photograph, comma, he deserves credit for a major technological innovation. So this time we have an argument. The person who uttered this sentence, the person who spoke or wrote this sentence, is making two separate claims. The first claim is that Edison invented the photograph. That's a statement. It's either true or false. And the person in this case is asserting the truth of it. As a matter of fact, the arguer is saying Edison invented the photograph. Now, because of that fact, the arguer claims, he deserves credit for a major technological innovation. So this time, the word since functions as a premise indicator. It's telling you which of the two propositions that make up that sentence is the premise and which one is the conclusion. So this is a nice example. What it shows is that the same word, namely since, sometimes functions in a temporal way, sometimes it functions in a logical way. Again, judgment is necessary in order to determine whether there's an argument in a passage. Okay, notice the second caution on page 15. Hurley says, it is not always easy to detect the occurrence of an inferential relationship between the statements in a passage, and one may have to review a passage several times before making a decision. So again, use your judgment. Read and reread the passage. Try to figure out what the author is doing. Is the author trying to persuade you of something? And if so, what? That what would be the conclusion of the author's argument. And the rest of the statements, or at least some of the other statements, would then serve as premises that support that conclusion. So reading a passage several times or listening to a passage several times is the key to interpreting it and determining whether it expresses an argument. And in the rest of this section, Hurley goes over some non-arguments. These are passages that may be thought to be arguments, but in fact they're not. So let's go through them one at a time. The first type Hurley calls simple non-inferential passages. Let me say that again. Simple non-inferential passages. The word non-inferential means not arguments. These are not arguments. And there are several types, all of which have the following in common. In all of these simple non-inferential passages, there may well be several propositions being asserted by the author of the passage, but the author stops short of making that important claim that one of them follows from the other or others. And without that claim, you don't have an argument. So let's take a look at some of these non-arguments or non-inferential passages. The first is a warning. All of you are familiar with these. Hurley has some examples. Suppose I said to you, watch out that you don't slip on the ice. I'm giving you warning of a potential risk or danger. I'm not arguing. I'm not trying to persuade you to believe or do something. I'm simply giving you a heads up. Okay? There's no claim being made in this short passage that a particular proposition follows from one or more others. Okay? So Hurley says, if no evidence is given to prove that these statements are true, there's no argument. So don't confuse warnings with arguments. They're different. Okay, next example, a piece of advice. Sometimes we offer advice to others, either solicited advice or unsolicited. Sometimes people ask us for our advice because they believe we have wisdom or good judgment. Sometimes we offer advice without being asked. That's called unsolicited. So one example of this, just reading from Hurley on page 16, you should keep a few things in mind before buying a used car. Test drive the car at varying speeds and conditions. Examine the oil in the crankcase. Ask to see service records and, if possible, have the engine and powertrain checked by a mechanic. So that's the kind of advice that someone who's knowledgeable about automobiles might give to someone who's thinking of buying an automobile, but who doesn't have a body of experience to draw upon. Notice that no evidence is being provided by the author of this passage. No evidence is being provided that a particular proposition follows from one or more others, or that there's some inferential relationship between the propositions. So giving advice to somebody is not arguing with them. The third example is what Hurley calls a statement of belief or opinion. Now, sometimes we simply offer to other people our belief. We tell people what we believe. I may say to someone, I believe in God. Or perhaps I'll tell someone I don't believe in God. And I may go no further than that. I may just leave that statement of belief hanging there with no evidence offered to support it, no reasons given why someone else should believe it. I'm giving my opinion. That's another way to think of it. It's an unsupported opinion. It's a mere statement of belief or opinion. And that is not in itself an argument. Now, if I do go on to provide support for my belief or opinion that I've stated, then I'm making an argument. But I'm assuming in this case that no further, that no support was given, no inferential claim was being made. Okay? Next example of a non-inferential passage down near the bottom of page 16. Loosely associated statements. Now, these can be on any topic. Sometimes we simply put together a number of distinct statements or propositions. We make no claim that one of them follows from any of the others. We're simply telling a story or explaining, not necessarily explaining something, because that's going to come later, but we're telling a story to somebody. So someone may say the following: not to honor men of worth will keep the people from contention. Not to value goods that are hard to come by will keep them from theft. Not to display what is desirable will keep them from being unsettled of mind. Again, this passage, which is an actual passage, is not an argument, because there's no claim being made by the author that a proposition follows from one or more others. All right, one more example, a report. Sometimes we issue reports to people. We inform people of what happened, for example. Here is an historian describing something, giving a report of something. The period of 1648 to 1789 was one of competition among the primary monarchs of Europe. Wars among the great powers were frequent but limited. France made major efforts to become paramount, but the balance of power operated to block French expansion. So you can think of that as narrative history. This historian is describing or reporting the events that occurred in the distant past. And so there's no argument being made in this passage. Now, Hurley goes on to point out on page 17 that sometimes people make reports about arguments. So suppose I am lecturing on some religious topic. I may report to you that some philosopher, Descartes, for example, made what's called an ontological argument in favor of the existence of God. I myself am not making any argument. What I'm doing is reporting to you, my audience, that Descartes made an argument. So Hurley gives an example of that. A report about an argument is not itself an argument. You see the difference? Now, you might go on to try to figure out what the underlying argument is, but you must keep in mind that I'm not the one making that argument. I'm simply telling you that it was made and who made it. And so you may try to understand the argument, even though I'm not the one who made that argument to you. Okay, so notice that in the heading, under the heading Simple Non-Inferential Passages, Hurley has all of the following. He has warning, a piece of advice, statement of belief or opinion, loosely associated statements, and finally, reports. So you should make a flashcard with each of these terms on it. All of them are defined not only in the text itself, but in the glossary at the back of the book. So there could easily be a question on the exam. It could be a true-false question. I may say, for example, a report is such and such, true or false. And you need to know whether it's true or false. Let's move on now to what are called expository passages. Sometimes when people speak or write, their objective is not to prove anything. Their objective is not to support any particular proposition by citing others as evidence. They are simply engaged in what's called expository writing. Let's take a look at one example of this from Hurley. On page 17, near the bottom, I'll use the first example. This is by John Hill and Doris Kolb. It's a book on chemistry. Here's what they say. There are three familiar states of matter: solid, liquid, and gas. Solid objects ordinarily maintain their shape and volume regardless of their location. A liquid occupies a definite volume, but assumes the shape of the occupied portion of its container. A gas maintains neither shape nor volume. It expands to fill completely whatever container it is in. So the authors of this passage aren't arguing. They're not making any inferential claim. They're not even explaining. They're simply they're simply telling the reader the nature of these concepts and how they differ from one another. The concepts are solid, liquid, and gas. So that's called expository writing. Hurley defines it in the margin on page 17 as a kind of non-argument that begins with a topic sentence followed by one or more sentences that develop the topic sentence. And you can see in the example I just read, the first sentence is the topic sentence. It tells you that there are three states of matter. And the rest of that passage expands upon it. It tells you a little bit specifically about each of those three states, solid, liquid, and gas. So it's not an argument, and it's not even an explanation. Okay, turn the page. Let's talk a little bit about illustrations. Sometimes when we're talking or writing, we are making general points or abstract points, and we want our readers to understand them, so we give illustrations or provide examples of them. So this would not be an argument. Even if you use words like thus, you're still not arguing. You're illustrating something or giving an example of something. That's what I mentioned earlier about the word thus. Yes, the word thus is a conclusion indicator, but it's not a guarantor. It doesn't guarantee that what follows it is a conclusion of an argument. Sometimes the word thus is used to indicate to the reader that an example is coming. So here's an example given by Hurley. The first example near the bottom of page 18. Chemical elements as well as compounds can be represented by molecular formulas. Thus, there's that key word, thus oxygen is represented by the symbol O sub 2, water by H2O, and sodium chloride by NaCl. So the word thus in that passage does not indicate that there's an argument, because no claim is being made that the second proposition follows from or is supported by the first. The claim is that the second proposition gives an example of the first more general proposition. So be wary of that word thus. It sometimes goes with an argument, sometimes it goes with an illustration or example. Now, I wish it were that simple, but as Hurley points out, some passages can be interpreted either as illustrations or as arguments. And again, that calls for judgment. You'll have to read the passage carefully, perhaps more than once, and try to put yourself into the mind of the author if you can. Ask yourself, is this author more likely arguing, that is, trying to persuade somebody of something, or is the author merely giving an illustration of something that's more general or more abstract? Now, two or more people, equally reasonable, could read the same passage and arrive at a different conclusion. One person may interpret the passage as an argument, another may interpret it as an illustration. Now, that may be disturbing to you that people could disagree about that, but many things in life are subject to interpretation, and we don't always have unanimity on any given topic among reasonable people. Even scientists disagree in their work about how the world is. Philosophers certainly disagree, and sometimes it's a matter of interpreting things in different ways or by different standards. So interpretation is always required when you examine a passage, and all you can do is make your best judgment. Do the best you can, and be prepared to explain why you think the passage expresses an argument. Suppose you and I are looking at the same passage, the same written passage. You may examine it and conclude that it expresses an argument. I may examine it and conclude otherwise. I may conclude that it's a mere illustration. You may ask me then, Keith, why do you interpret this passage as an illustration? I might then explain myself. I may point to particular words or the order in which the propositions appear, or I may point out that the proposition following the word thus is an example of a more general proposition. I may also ask you, why do you interpret the passage as an argument? So what we've done is we've started a dialogue. Two reasonable people examining the same passage come to a different conclusion initially about what is going on in that passage. We can then, in discussing it, perhaps one of us will persuade the other that it's really an argument, or it's best interpreted as an argument, or perhaps that it's best interpreted as an illustration. So well-meaning people, equally intelligent, equally reasonable, can disagree about things like this. And when people disagree, if they're rational, they will try to resolve their disagreements peacefully by discussing them and trying to give reasons in support of whatever view they think is correct. Let's turn now to explanations. There's a 2-page section on that, beginning on page 19. The main difference between an explanation and an argument is this, and I'm simply following what Hurley says, but putting it in my own words. We rarely, if ever, explain things that are already believed to be true. For example, everyone knows that dogs bark. You may hear my dogs bark during the lecture. They're outside right now, but if they bark at some passerby, you may hear it. We know, you know, I know, everyone knows that dogs bark. But we don't know why dogs bark. Really. I read an article about this many years ago in the Smithsonian magazine. The title was "Hark, Hark, the Dogs Do Bark." And it was fascinating to me, as someone who has had dogs and loves dogs. It was fascinating to me that something so simple still is not understood. Scientists have used every conceivable technique to determine what it is that makes dogs bark. They've done spectrographic analyses of their barking. They've compared the noises made by dogs with the noises made by wolves and other canines, and so on. And at the end of the article, the conclusion was scientists simply don't know yet why dogs bark. So I may try to explain to you why dogs bark, but it would be silly of me to try to persuade you that dogs bark. So the main function of an explanation is to take something that's already known or already believed and shed light on it, right? To shine a lantern on it, to make it understood why it occurs or why it is the case. Arguments are different. When we argue with others, the assumption is that the other does not already believe my conclusion. If you don't believe the proposition that I do, I may try to get you to believe it. And the way I get you to believe it is not twisting your arms and getting you to say I believe it, because that's not real persuasion. The way for me to persuade you to believe it is to produce reasons that you accept and from which the conclusion follows. In other words, the way for me to get you to believe the proposition is to persuade you rationally by supplying evidence, reasons in favor of that proposition. So to put it as pithily as I can, to put it as simply as I can, we explain what is already believed. We persuade people of things they don't already believe. So keep that distinction in mind when you examine a passage. You should look for the statement that is more obvious and the one or ones that are less obvious. And that may help you determine whether an explanation is being expressed by that passage or an argument. Now, explanations have some special terms, and I'd like you to know them. Every explanation has two parts. There's the proposition or statement that's being explained, and that's called the explanandum. Explanandum. You can see that word on page 19 near the bottom. The statements or propositions that do the explaining are called the explanands. So you can remember these in any way you want. I've always remembered them as follows. The one that is being explained has the longer word. Explanandum is a longer word than explanans. So use something like that to help you remember the difference. Okay? So you could expect a question on the exam, such as a true-false question. The part of an explanation that does the explaining is the explanandum. True or false? Well, now you can see that would be false. Right? The part of the explanation that does the explaining is the explanans, not the explanandum. So keep those two terms straight in your mind, and you may find that you are able to answer one or more questions correctly on the exam. Now, I like the way Hurley puts it at the top of page 20, just a few lines down from the top of the page. Hurley says, the purpose of the explanans is to show why something is the case, whereas in an argument, the purpose of the premises is to prove that something is the case. Okay, so we don't argue that dogs bark. We may well try to explain why they bark. Okay, now I wish it were cut and dried, and so far I've made it seem as though it's cut and dried, but once again, judgment is required. There may be a given passage that could be interpreted either as an argument or as an explanation. And Hurley gives two examples on page 20. One of them involves the drinking of alcohol. You can read those over for yourself and see how either one of those short passages could be interpreted as an argument or as an explanandum. One reason you can't always make a definitive judgment about whether a passage expresses an argument or an explanation is because people's knowledge differs. Everyone, I think, knows that dogs bark, but take another proposition. Not everyone knows who won the 2006 Tour de France. Do you know? I know. The Tour de France in 2006 was won by American Floyd Landis. Now, he was eventually stripped of his title for the use of performance-enhancing drugs, but he did initially win the 2006 tour. So suppose someone is wondering why Floyd Landis won the tour that year. What was it about him? Did he train particularly well? Did he take drugs that assisted him in winning? Did he have a good team? Was that part of his success? And so forth. Maybe he had a better bike than the other competitors or rivals. I may try to persuade someone who doesn't know that Floyd Landis won the 2006 Tour de France. I may give you reasons to believe that he won the Tour de France. In other words, I may try to persuade you or argue you into believing that. But someone who already knows that Floyd Landis won the tour won't need persuading. What that person may need is an explanation of why Landis won the tour that year. So since different people have different bodies of knowledge, a particular passage that serves as an argument for one of them may serve as an explanation for the other one. And that's because our knowledge and our beliefs differ. Okay, so we always need to know the intended audience. If you're trying to determine whether a passage expresses an argument or an explanation, try to figure out what the audience is or who the audience is first and what they know and what they believe. And that may be a clue to you as to how to interpret the passage. Okay, still with me? I'm about 36 minutes in. I'm still keeping my fingers crossed that when I shut this down, everything goes well. We'll see. I fear that the longer I go, the more unlikely it is to save and upload, but I'm not going to let that affect how long I go today. I'm just going to keep going as long as it takes and hope that it uploads, that it saves and uploads. Okay. Let's turn to the next type of non-argument. On page 20 near the bottom, you'll see a section entitled Conditional Statements. Conditional statements are simply if-then statements or if-then sentences. Sometimes we say if such and such, comma, then so and so. We use this kind of language all the time. I may say if Alabama beats LSU Saturday, then Alabama will win the SEC championship. I may say if you do such and such to me again, then I will turn you in or complain to the police or whatever. I may say that if 3 is greater than 2, then 2 is greater than 1. So there are lots of different kinds of if-then sentences. And the thing you need to remember is that an if-then sentence all by itself is not an argument. Right? The main reason is this. The if part of an if-then sentence is not being asserted by the person who states it. Suppose I say to you, if Alabama beats LSU Saturday, then it will win the SEC championship. I am not necessarily asserting that Alabama will beat LSU. In fact, I may believe that it won't happen. What I'm saying is, if that were to happen, then such and such would be the case. Notice, since I'm not asserting that it will happen, I'm not arguing. Because when you argue, you are asserting the premises as true and then making a further claim that the conclusion follows from them. So the first point I want to make, and I want to make it very clearly, is that conditional statements, if-then statements, are not themselves arguments. And the reason for that is when you argue, you are making an assertion that the premises are true and then a further assertion that the conclusion follows from them. When you state a conditional statement, when you make a conditional statement, you are not asserting the if part of it, and you are not asserting the other part, the then part. Let's give names to the two parts of a conditional statement. And these names you'll see come up again and again and again throughout the course. So let's learn them early, and we'll come back to them several times. The if part of an if-then sentence is called the antecedent. And you'll see these terms at the top of page 21 in Hurley. The antecedent is the statement that follows the word if. The other part of an if-then sentence, the part that follows the word then, is called the consequent. And again, both of these terms appear on the top of page 21. So the reason we give the parts of a conditional statement names is so that we can refer to them by name. I may say to you, when we're looking at a particular conditional statement, I may say, the antecedent is true. Well, since you know what the antecedent of it is, now that I've taught you, you'll know exactly which statement I'm referring to when I say the antecedent is true. What if I said the consequent of this conditional statement is false? Again, you know exactly which statement I'm referring to. So the way to remember these terms is the word antecedent begins with A-N-T-E, ante, which means before. So that's the part that appears before the other one. And the word consequent has sequent in it. You know that the sequel of a book or movie is the movie or book that comes later, after the original one. So there was initially a Jurassic Park movie. The sequel was the one that followed it or came later. So the word consequent means later. It came later. So antecedent comes before, consequent comes later. That should help you remember the difference between them. Okay, so the first point I've been making is that conditional statements are not themselves arguments. But if you look at page 22, Hurley explains very well, in my opinion, that conditional statements, while not themselves arguments, can become parts of arguments. A particular conditional statement may be the first premise of an argument that contains more than one premise. A conditional statement might even serve as the conclusion of an argument. We'll see examples of this in subsequent sections and chapters of this book, although Hurley does give some examples there on page 22, which I won't bother going over with you. And the final thing I want to talk with you today about is sufficient and necessary conditions. Now, when you say that a condition is sufficient for something else, what you're saying is that it's enough. It's all it takes. So let's look at this course, for example. I've told you on the syllabus and in my first lecture on the first day of class, I told you that in order to get an A in this course, you need a final score of 90 or more. So we can say that getting a score of 90 or more is necessary for getting an A in the course, but it's also sufficient, isn't it? If you get 90, then you will get an A. Okay? Getting 90 is sufficient. It suffices. It's enough. You don't need anything more than that. If you get 90 or higher, you've got enough to get an A. We could say that getting a score of at least 90 is necessary for getting an A. And what we mean by that is, in order to get an A, you need at least 90 as your final score. Suppose you got a score of 88. Since that's not 90 or higher, you've not achieved what is a necessary condition for getting an A. So you can understand these terms, necessary and sufficient condition, by referring to the way I've set this course up. Getting an A is both necessary and sufficient. Getting a score of 90 or more is both necessary and sufficient for getting an A. Let me pursue this just a little bit more. Suppose you got a score of 95, exactly 95. Let me ask you, is getting a final score in this course of exactly 95 sufficient for getting an A in this course? Think for a moment. It is, isn't it? 95 suffices for getting an A. What I mean by that is it's enough. It'll do the job. But getting a score of exactly 95 is not necessary for getting an A. There are other ways to get an A besides getting exactly 95. Okay? So getting a score of exactly 95 is sufficient for getting an A, but not necessary for getting an A. Let's pursue it. One more example. What about a score of 85? Let's just pick 85. A score of exactly 85. Is a score of 85 sufficient for getting an A in here? In this course? Does it suffice? Clearly it does not. If you got a score of 85, you do not have enough points for an A. So the first thing we can say is a score of 85 exactly is not sufficient for getting an A. Is a score of exactly 85 necessary for getting an A? Do you need to get exactly 85 in order to get an A? Obviously not. There are other scores that will get you an A, 90 or 91 or 92 and so on. Now, one more example. I'm not trying to trick you, but what about a score of at least 85? Is a score of at least 85, meaning 85 or higher, sufficient for getting an A? Suppose you got a score of at least 85. Is that enough for an A? It's not. Because if you got a score of 86, that's at least 85, but you won't get an A. It's not enough. But getting a score of at least 85 is necessary for getting an A in this course, isn't it? In order to get an A, you've got to have at least 85. So getting a score of at least 85 is necessary for getting an A, but not sufficient. So you can play around with those numbers if you want. It may help you understand these important concepts, necessary and sufficient condition. And the way to remember them is as follows. Suppose you have an if-then sentence. Suppose you have a conditional statement. If such and such, then so and so. In fact, let me just use letters for the such and so part. Suppose we use the letters P and Q to stand for particular propositions or statements. We have if P, comma, then Q. Whenever you have a conditional like that, the if part is sufficient for the Q part. So proposition P is sufficient for proposition Q. Going from left to right, you have a sufficient condition. Now suppose you look at it from right to left. Q, as it turns out, is necessary for P. So the second part, the consequent, is necessary for the antecedent. So from left to right, you have sufficiency. From right to left, you have necessity. Okay, you have to find a way to remember those. Sufficiency flows from left to right, and necessity flows from right to left. And you can see Hurley's example involving dogs and animals down near the bottom of page 22. Being a dog is sufficient for being an animal, but it's not necessary. You don't have to be a dog to be an animal. You could be a cat and still be an animal. Being an animal is necessary for being a dog, but it's not sufficient. Just being an animal isn't enough for you to be a dog. You can be a cat, which is an animal, but that doesn't make you a dog. So you need to think about these examples until they're straight in your mind, until they're clear in your mind. Okay, let's look over the material at the end of this section. On page 23, Hurley has a nice summary of everything that we've just covered, or that he's just covered. Notice that he points out that when you're interpreting a passage to determine whether it contains an argument, look for three things. First of all, indicator words like thus, therefore, since, because, so, and so forth. Secondly, ask yourself whether there is any inferential relationship between the statements that make up that passage. If you see that one of the statements follows from one or more of the others, that's an inference. And that's a good indication that there's an argument there in that passage. And third, you should keep in mind all the possible non-arguments that we went over. If it looks like a report or a warning or a piece of advice or a conditional statement or an explanation, then it's not an argument. It's not best interpreted as an argument. So again, the process of determining whether a passage contains or expresses an argument calls for judgment, it calls for interpretation, and that requires practice. The more you practice at anything, the better you get at it. And that's why Hurley provides so many examples. You'll notice on page 23, Roman numeral 1, he has a series of, 35 passages, all quite short actually, 35 passages, and he says, determine which of the following passages are arguments. So these are passages for you to practice what we've just learned. Now I can't do that for you. That's what you need to do to learn how to identify arguments. Right? I've explained the techniques. I've shown you what to look for. Now you've got to actually do it. It would be like, suppose I'm teaching you how to shoot free throws in basketball. Maybe you're a kid, and I've been playing basketball for a long time. I can explain to you the techniques. I can say, when you hold the ball prior to shooting it, put your fingers on the ridge or hold it a certain way. I can explain that to you. I can show you with my own hands how to hold the ball. I could discuss the physics of shooting a basketball with you, and on and on and on. But ultimately, in order for you to become proficient at shooting that ball and making a high percentage of free throws, is to get out and shoot over and over and over again. I've heard stories of Pete Maravich, the great basketball player at LSU and in the professional ranks. He played at LSU. His father was his coach there. And when he was a young man, his father made him shoot. Before he could come in for dinner, he had to make some number of free throws in the basketball area outside the house. He had to make like 100 free throws before he could come in for dinner every night. So imagine how proficient he would be after a while, shooting free throw after free throw, day after day after day. He got to the point where he could make a free throw practically with his eyes closed. In fact, I'm sure he did many times close his eyes just to see whether he could make it. And I'll bet he did most of the time. So let's apply that to what we're doing right now. In order for you to become proficient at identifying arguments or recognizing arguments, you need to work many exercises. Luckily for you, for us, all of these exercises are solved or answered in the solutions manual that I've posted on Canvas. So give it your best shot. Try to identify the conclusion in every passage. If you believe it is an argument, and then check your work. And if you get it wrong, if you think it's an argument but it's not, try to figure out why. If you still can't figure it out, send me an email and I'll try to explain it to you. Okay? So that's Roman numeral 1. On page 27, Roman numeral 2, Hurley says the following selections were originally submitted as letters to the editor of newspapers and magazines. Determine which of them can, with good reason, be considered arguments. And if you determine that a particular passage does contain an argument, then the next step is to identify the conclusion. And once you get that, you can usually figure out which of the remaining propositions are premises. Either all of the other ones are premises or some of them are premises. Okay, Roman numeral 3 on page 29, Hurley says the following statements represent conclusions for arguments. And notice he gives 2 alternatives for each one. Look at number 2. Street drugs should not be legalized. And Hurley says you can pick either one of those. You can argue for the proposition that street drugs should be legalized, or for the proposition street drugs should not be legalized. So pick one of those 2 propositions and give some reasons for it. In other words, try to construct an argument in favor of that proposition. This is good practice for learning how to construct an argument. Roman numeral 4 is simply define the following terms. And this is where the flashcards I recommended to you will come in handy. If you've made flashcards and written down all the definitions of the key terms and committed them to memory, you should have no problem if a particular definition appears on the exam. And finally, part 5, 10 true-false. Whoops, not finally. It's not the final section. But part 5 consists of 10 true-false exercises, some of which may appear on the exam. So it's important that you work all of these and try to remember. I don't know whether you can see that, but occasionally my computer screen starts to go dark and I have to move my mouse to make it light again. I'm not sure whether that's being recorded or only I am seeing that, but I'll always try to do it quickly in case you're seeing it. I'll always move the mouse as quickly as I can. Roman numeral 6 on page 30, fill in the blanks with necessary and sufficient conditions. Let's take a look at number 1. We'll work that one together. Being a tiger is a blank condition for being an animal. Okay, so think about that. Is being a tiger a sufficient condition for being an animal? Suppose you're a tiger, or suppose some particular being is a tiger. Is that enough for that being to be an animal? It sure seems to be, doesn't it? So we know that being a tiger is sufficient for being an animal. But is it also necessary? Do you have to be a tiger in order to be an animal? Clearly, you do not have to be. Right? So being a tiger is sufficient for being an animal, but not necessary. Okay, in some of these examples, you will be writing the word sufficient on the blank line. In some of them, you'll be writing the word necessary. In none of them will you be writing both necessary and sufficient. But sometimes that is the case, isn't it? Remember our example earlier? Getting a final score in my course of 90 or more is both necessary and sufficient for getting an A in this course. So sometimes a particular condition is both necessary and sufficient for some other condition to be the case. And sometimes a condition is neither necessary nor sufficient for some other condition. Here's an example. Being a bachelor is neither necessary nor sufficient for being happy. Right? You don't have to be a bachelor in order to be happy. Right? So being a bachelor is not a necessary condition for being happy, and it's not sufficient either. You could be an unhappy bachelor. So merely being a bachelor is unrelated to being happy. It's not necessary for being happy, and it's not sufficient either. So there are 4 possibilities. A given condition may be both necessary and sufficient for some other condition. It may be neither necessary nor sufficient for some other condition. It may be sufficient but not necessary. And fourth and finally, it can be necessary but not sufficient. So Hurley's exercise contains only 2 of those 4 possibilities, right? You're going to write the word sufficient or the word necessary, not both and not neither. But I'm simply telling you that he could have created an exercise with all 4 possibilities. And finally, part Roman numeral 7, page through a book, magazine, or newspaper and find 2 arguments, one with indicator words, the other without. Copy the arguments as written, giving the appropriate reference. Then identify the premises and conclusion of each. Now that may seem like a lot of work to you, but I assume you want a good grade in the course. Every exercise in this book is designed to help you understand the material and perform well on the exam. So all I'll say is, if you want a good grade, you will work hard, study hard, practice a lot, stay on top of things, and you should get a good grade if you do all those things. There's no guarantee. How about this? Studying hard, studying long and hard is not a sufficient condition for getting an A in the course. You may do those things and still not get an A. There's no guarantee. I would say, though, that studying long and hard is necessary for getting a good grade in the course. I can't imagine you getting an A in the course if you do little or no studying. You see what I'm saying? So studying hard is necessary but not sufficient for getting a good grade in here. Okay, I'm almost exactly 1 hour into this lecture. Now I know we have an hour and 15 minutes devoted to each lecture. One reason the lectures have been short so far, and may continue to be shorter than 1 hour and 15 minutes, is that there's no questioning and answering. In a typical class, students will be raising their hands and I will be responding to their queries. So that takes a little bit of time. So when we're in the classroom, when you tack on the discussions that we have back and forth, it increases the amount of time that we're in class. So it would stand to reason that my lectures online will be a little bit shorter than an hour and 15 minutes. Today we're going about an hour and 1 minute. But there may be a day when we take the whole hour and 15 minutes or hour and 20 minutes. Okay, that's enough for today. For Tuesday's class next week, please read very carefully section 1.3. Hurley discusses the important distinction between deductive arguments and inductive arguments in that section, with plenty of examples. And also there are lots of different deductive argument forms and inductive argument forms that we'll be going over. So try to stay ahead of me in the reading. Read section 1.3 for Tuesday. Have a great day and a great weekend. Keep your fingers crossed. I certainly am, that I can get this video recorded and uploaded. Okay, see you Tuesday.